In the remote valleys of southeastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains rise like ancient guardians against the sky, there exists a cemetery that appears on no official records. Local residents call it the Garden of Purified Angels, though few dare to speak its name aloud. Between 1834 and 1859, 156 infants were secretly buried in this hidden graveyard, their tiny bodies laid to rest, not by grieving parents, but by the very women who brought them into this world. The Morrison sisters, Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes, were revered as the most skilled midwives in 3 counties, credited with safely delivering over 800 babies during their 25-year practice. But recently discovered journals, hidden for over a century and a half in the walls of their former homestead, reveal a truth so disturbing that it challenges everything we thought we knew about faith, medicine, and the sacred duty of those who assist in bringing life into the world. These meticulously kept records detail systematic infanticide disguised as divine intervention, carried out by women who believed they were saving the world from children marked by evil. Before we delve into the horrifying details of what the Morrison sisters called their holy work, I need to know, are you brave enough to hear the complete truth? This channel isn't for everyone, only for those who dare to uncover the darkest secrets hidden in America's past. If you have the courage to learn about the Morrison sisters' twisted mission, hit that subscribe button and comment below, telling us what state you're listening from. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, and this one will test even the strongest stomachs. Let's discover together what drove 3 God-fearing women to commit acts so heinous that their own community would have hanged them if the truth had been known. Now, let me take you back to the misty hollers of Kentucky, where the Morrison sisters began their reign of terror disguised as mercy. The year 1834 marked a turning point in the isolated mountain communities of Harlan County, Kentucky. This was a land where Baptist and Methodist congregations flourished among families who had carved their existence from unforgiving wilderness, where the nearest doctor lived 3 days' ride away, and where the arrival of a skilled midwife could mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. The Morrison sisters had established themselves as indispensable figures in this harsh landscape. Their reputation built on years of successful deliveries and their unwavering devotion to their Baptist faith. Margaret Morrison, the eldest at 42, possessed hands that seemed blessed by divine providence. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes held an intensity that many mistook for religious fervor. She spoke in measured tones, quoting scripture with the precision of a trained preacher, and carried herself with the authority of someone who had looked death in the face countless times and emerged victorious. Catherine, 38, served as the practical backbone of their operation. Her auburn hair and sturdy frame made her appear almost masculine, but her gentle touch with laboring mothers earned her widespread trust. Agnes, the youngest at 35, possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed almost otherworldly. Her dark hair and large, expressive eyes gave her an appearance that many described as angelic, though her soft voice carried an unsettling undercurrent that few could define. The sisters lived in a modest 2-story cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the Cumberland River, its weathered logs bearing witness to countless mountain storms. Their home served as both residence and medical facility, with the lower floor converted into a birthing room complete with specially crafted beds, surgical instruments ordered from Louisville, and an extensive collection of herbs and remedies that they cultivated in their carefully tended garden. The upper floor housed their personal quarters and what they called their prayer room, a space dedicated to their increasingly fanatical interpretation of Baptist doctrine. The Appalachian communities they served were predominantly Baptist, with scattered Methodist congregations and the occasional Presbyterian family who had ventured into the mountains seeking religious freedom. These were deeply devout people who saw God's hand in every aspect of their lives, from the success of their crops to the safe arrival of their children. The Morrison sisters understood this religious landscape intimately, weaving their services seamlessly into the spiritual fabric of their patients' lives. They would lead prayers during difficult labors, quote scripture to comfort anxious fathers, and offer what appeared to be profound spiritual guidance to families facing the uncertainties of childbirth. Their practice extended across 3 counties, serving families scattered throughout the Cumberland Gap region. Word of their skill had spread through the mountains like wildfire, carried by grateful mothers who credited the Morrison sisters with saving their lives and those of their babies. They charged modest fees, often accepting payment in the form of livestock, vegetables, or simple household goods, which endeared them to impoverished mountain families who might otherwise have faced childbirth without skilled assistance. The sisters' daily routine reflected their deep religious convictions. They rose before dawn for private prayer, spent their mornings tending to their medicinal garden, and devoted their afternoons to visiting expectant mothers or studying medical texts that Margaret had acquired from a retiring doctor in Lexington. Their evenings were reserved for what they called spiritual preparation, intense prayer sessions where they sought divine guidance for their calling. It was during these evening sessions that their interpretation of Scripture began to evolve in ways that would have horrified their Baptist congregation. The mountains themselves seemed to foster the sisters' growing isolation from conventional religious thought. The harsh winters, treacherous terrain, and weeks of separation from other families created an environment where extreme beliefs could flourish unchecked. The Morrison sisters began to see themselves as divinely appointed guardians of spiritual purity, tasked with protecting the world from what they believed were signs of demonic influence manifesting in newborn children. Their transformation from respected midwives to something far more sinister began gradually, almost imperceptibly. It started with their interpretation of birthmarks, which they began to view not as natural variations, but as literal marks of the devil. A strawberry birthmark on a child's forehead became a sign of unholy influence. A port wine stain on an infant's cheek was interpreted as a mark of spiritual corruption. What began as troubling observations slowly evolved into a systematic belief that certain children were born already claimed by evil forces. The isolated nature of their practice provided the perfect cover for their developing delusions. When a child was born with what they considered a mark of the devil, they would dismiss family members from the birthing room, claiming the need for private medical procedures. The trusting families, already exhausted from labor and grateful for the sisters' expertise, rarely questioned these requests. This was the beginning of what would become their most horrifying legacy. The first recorded purification, as the Morrison sisters would later call it in their journals, took place on a bitter February night in 1834. Sarah Mackenzie, a 19-year-old mother expecting her first child, had been in labor for nearly 18 hours in the sisters' cabin. The howling wind outside rattled the windows while snow piled against the doors, creating an atmosphere of isolation that seemed to amplify every sound within the small birthing room. Margaret Morrison, her hands stained with blood and her face glistening with perspiration, finally delivered the infant as the clock struck midnight. The baby boy emerged healthy and crying. But as Agnes cleaned him by lamplight, she noticed a large, dark birthmark covering nearly half of his left cheek. The mark was irregularly shaped, resembling what superstitious mountain folk might call a devil's handprint. Agnes held the child closer to the flickering flame, her eyes widening as she examined the mark more closely. She exchanged a meaningful glance with Margaret, who immediately moved to examine the infant herself. "Sister," Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Look at this mark. It's not natural. It's too dark, too perfect in its evil." Margaret took the baby, studying the birthmark with growing alarm. To her fevered imagination, the mark seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and she began to see patterns within its borders that suggested demonic symbols. Sarah Mackenzie, exhausted and delirious from her prolonged labor, called out weakly for her child. "Is my baby all right? Why isn't he crying anymore?" The sisters had instinctively moved to the far corner of the room, speaking in hushed tones while the infant lay wrapped in a blanket, his cries gradually subsiding. Margaret's mind raced as she stared at the birthmark. Years of intense biblical study had filled her thoughts with images of spiritual warfare, and she began to interpret the mark not as a simple birthmark, but as evidence of demonic possession. She remembered passages from Revelation about the mark of the beast and began to see parallels that terrified her. "Catherine," she called to her sister, who was tending to Sarah, "come here immediately. You need to see this." Catherine approached, wiping her hands on her apron, and gasped when she saw the birthmark. The three sisters huddled together, their faces illuminated by the dancing lamplight as they whispered about the spiritual implications of what they were seeing. In their increasingly fevered imagination, they began to believe that they were witnessing a literal manifestation of evil, that this innocent child had been marked by Satan himself. "We cannot allow this abomination to enter the world," Margaret declared, her voice filled with religious fervor. "God has placed this child in our hands for a reason. We must purify him before his corruption can spread." Agnes nodded solemnly, her angelic features twisted with misguided conviction. "It would be a mercy," she whispered, "to save him from a life of evil and save others from his influence." What happened next would haunt the Morrison sisters for the rest of their lives, though they would never admit it was wrong. Margaret, believing she was performing a divine service, placed her hands over the infant's nose and mouth. The baby struggled briefly before his movements ceased, his tiny body going limp in her arms. The sisters then turned to Sarah Mackenzie, who had mercifully lost consciousness from exhaustion and blood loss. When Sarah awakened hours later, Margaret approached her bedside with carefully practiced grief. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said, her voice heavy with false sorrow. "Your baby was born with complications. His spirit was called home to be with the Lord before he could suffer in this world. Sometimes God takes the pure ones early to spare them from earthly trials." Sarah's anguished cries echoed through the cabin as the sisters comforted her, speaking of God's mysterious ways and the blessing of knowing her child was safe in heaven. The infant was buried that same night in a small grave behind the Morrison cabin, the first of many that would eventually become their secret cemetery. The sisters marked the grave with a simple wooden cross and held a brief prayer service, convincing themselves that they had performed a sacred duty. They recorded the event in a journal that Margaret had begun keeping, writing in careful script. February 12th, 1834. Purified one marked by darkness. The Lord's work continues. As dawn broke over the mountains, the sisters began to craft their story. They told Sarah's husband, Thomas, that the baby had been born with severe internal defects that made survival impossible. They described fictional complications that sounded medically plausible to uneducated mountain folk, and they offered to handle the burial arrangements as a gesture of Christian charity. Thomas, grief-stricken and trusting, accepted their explanation and even thanked them for their kindness in sparing his wife the sight of their deformed child. The ease with which they had deceived the grieving parents both disturbed and emboldened the Morrison sisters. They began to see their deception as divinely inspired, a necessary component of their sacred mission. Over the following days, they refined their explanations and practiced their expressions of sympathy, preparing for future purifications that they now believed were inevitable. Word of the Mackenzie baby's death spread through the mountain communities, as such news always did, carried by neighbors and relatives who offered condolences and shared their own stories of infant mortality. The high rate of infant death in the mountains made the sisters' story entirely believable, and their reputation for skill and compassion actually increased as people praised their gentle handling of the tragedy. But the Morrison sisters had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They had tasted the intoxicating power of playing God, of making life and death decisions based on their twisted interpretation of divine will. The first murder had been committed in a moment of religious hysteria, but it would not be the last. In their private moments, they began to discuss the possibility that other children might be born with similar marks of evil. and they started to develop a systematic approach to identifying and eliminating what they saw as threats to spiritual purity. The transformation was complete. The Morrison sisters were no longer midwives guided by medical knowledge and Christian compassion. They had become something far more sinister, self-appointed agents of divine judgment, convinced that they alone possessed the wisdom to determine which children deserved to live and which should be purified before they could corrupt the world with their presence. The months following the Mackenzie tragedy marked a period of disturbing evolution for the Morrison sisters. What had begun as a single act of murderous delusion gradually transformed into a systematic theology of infanticide. They spent countless hours in their prayer room, poring over scripture and developing increasingly elaborate justifications for their actions. Margaret, as the eldest and most educated, became the primary architect of their twisted doctrine, while Catherine and Agnes served as eager disciples, validating and expanding upon her interpretations. Their study of biblical texts took on an obsessive quality. They focused particularly on passages dealing with spiritual purity, divine judgment, and the corruption of innocence. Margaret began to see connections between birthmarks, physical defects, and spiritual contamination that existed only in her fevered imagination. She compiled a detailed catalogue of what she called demonic markings, a comprehensive list of physical characteristics that she believed indicated infernal influence. According to their growing doctrine, strawberry birthmarks were signs of bloodthirsty nature, port wine stains indicated a propensity for violence, and any unusual coloring or texture of the skin suggested demonic touch. They extended their criteria to include physical defects such as cleft palates, extra fingers or toes, and any form of visible deformity. In their twisted logic, these conditions were not natural variations, but literal manifestations of evil that required immediate purification. The sisters' reputation in the mountain communities continued to grow, ironically enhanced by their careful management of subsequent tragedies. They had learned to present infant deaths as divine will, speaking eloquently about God's mysterious ways and the blessing of sparing imperfect children from earthly suffering. Their apparent expertise in handling such situations actually increased demand for their services, as families believed the Morrison sisters possessed special wisdom about life and death. Throughout 1834 and 1835, the sisters performed dozens of legitimate deliveries, caring for mothers and babies with genuine skill and compassion. But when infants were born with what they considered demonic markings, the routine became horrifyingly predictable. They would dismiss family members from the birthing room, claiming medical necessity, and then perform their purification ritual. The babies would be suffocated quickly and quietly, their struggles brief and unnoticed by exhausted mothers. The sisters developed an elaborate system for explaining these deaths to grieving families. They created fictional medical conditions with impressive-sounding names, described imaginary complications that required immediate intervention, and offered detailed explanations about why the babies could not survive. Their medical knowledge, combined with their religious authority, made their stories completely believable to uneducated mountain folk who had little choice but to trust their expertise. Agnes proved particularly skilled at comforting bereaved parents, her angelic appearance and soft voice providing solace to families destroyed by loss. She would spend hours with grieving mothers, reading scripture and offering theological explanations for their suffering. Her genuine tears and apparent empathy masked the fact that she had helped orchestrate the very tragedies she was now counseling others to accept. Catherine took responsibility for the practical aspects of their secret cemetery. She selected a secluded area behind their cabin, hidden by dense forest and accessible only through a narrow path known only to the sisters. She dug the tiny graves herself, working by moonlight to avoid detection, and created a careful record of each burial location. The cemetery began to take on the appearance of a small garden, with Catherine planting wildflowers and herbs around the grave sites to create the illusion of natural growth. The sisters' journal entries from this period reveal the depth of their delusion and the systematic nature of their crimes. Margaret wrote extensively about their divine mission, describing each purification as a victory against demonic forces. She recorded detailed observations about the physical characteristics of their victims, noting patterns that existed only in her imagination. Her entries became increasingly elaborate, filled with religious imagery and biblical quotations that justified their actions. As their practice expanded, the sisters began to develop preferences for certain types of markings. They seemed particularly disturbed by birthmarks on the face or hands, which they believed indicated that the child would use those features to spread evil influence. They also showed special concern for babies born with unusual coloring, such as the blue-tinged skin that sometimes resulted from minor circulation issues during birth. The isolation of their mountain practice provided perfect cover for their activities. Families lived far apart, communication was limited, and the high infant mortality rate made additional deaths unremarkable. The sisters' reputation for skill and compassion actually worked in their favor, as grieving parents found comfort in believing that their babies had been attended by the most capable midwives in the region. But perhaps most disturbing was the sisters' growing sense of divine approval. They began to interpret coincidences and natural events as signs of God's pleasure with their work. A successful harvest following a purification was seen as divine blessing. A difficult winter that claimed several adults was interpreted as punishment for those who had questioned their judgment. They created an elaborate system of supernatural cause and effect that reinforced their belief in their sacred mission. By the end of 1835, the Morrison sisters had murdered 12 infants, each death carefully documented in their journal, and each victim buried in their secret cemetery. They had perfected their methods, refined their explanations, and convinced themselves that they were performing the most important work of their lives. The transformation from skilled midwives to systematic killers was complete, and they showed no signs of questioning their actions or considering the possibility that they might be wrong. The stage was set for 2 decades of horror that would claim the lives of over 150 innocent children, all in the name of religious purity and divine judgment. The Morrison sisters had become something unprecedented in American criminal history. Female serial killers who used their medical expertise and religious authority to commit acts of unspeakable evil while maintaining the complete trust and respect of their community. The year 1840 brought unexpected complications to the Morrison sisters' carefully orchestrated reign of terror. Rebecca Whitmore, a 23-year-old mother from a prominent Methodist family, had requested their services for the birth of her 3rd child. The Whitmores were known throughout the region for their education and their connections to the growing Methodist movement, which emphasized personal spiritual experience and social reform. Unlike many of their previous clients, Rebecca possessed both literacy and a questioning nature that would prove dangerous to the sisters' secret operations. The delivery took place on a sweltering July evening, with thunder rumbling in the distance and the air thick with the promise of rain. Rebecca's labor progressed normally until the moment of birth, when her daughter emerged with a distinctive birthmark covering her left shoulder and upper arm. The mark was deep red and roughly shaped like a crescent moon, clearly visible and unmistakably what the Morrison sisters considered a sign of demonic influence. Margaret immediately recognized the birthmark as fitting their criteria for purification, but Rebecca's alertness and education presented a unique challenge. Unlike their usual clients, who were often exhausted and trusting, Rebecca remained conscious and demanding throughout the process. She insisted on holding her daughter immediately after birth, examining the baby carefully while the sisters exchanged worried glances. "What is this mark on her shoulder?" Rebecca asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Is it something that will affect her health?" Margaret began to formulate one of their standard explanations about spiritual corruption, but Rebecca's medical knowledge, gained from her educated upbringing, allowed her to recognize the birthmark as a common and harmless condition. "This is simply a strawberry hemangioma," Rebecca declared, using medical terminology that surprised the sisters. "My cousin in Louisville had one very similar. It will fade as she grows older and poses no threat to her health." She clutched her daughter protectively, her eyes moving between the three sisters as she noticed their unusual behavior. The sisters found themselves in an unprecedented situation. Their standard methods of deception would not work on an educated woman who understood basic medical principles. They could not claim the birthmark indicated fatal complications, nor could they convince Rebecca that her daughter was suffering from life-threatening conditions. For the first time in their murderous career, they were forced to complete a delivery without performing their purification ritual. Agnes attempted to salvage the situation by focusing on spiritual concerns rather than medical ones. "Sometimes these marks indicate spiritual challenges that the child will face," she suggested carefully. "We should perform special prayers to protect her from evil influences." But Rebecca, secure in her Methodist faith and confident in her medical knowledge, dismissed such superstitions as outdated thinking. "My daughter is perfectly healthy and blessed by God," Rebecca stated firmly. "I will not have her subjected to unnecessary rituals or treatments." She named the baby Grace and insisted on taking her home immediately, despite the sisters' protests that she needed time to recover from the birth. The Morrison sisters watched helplessly as Rebecca departed with her marked child, carrying what they believed to be a vessel of evil influence into the world. This failure to perform their divine duty filled them with anxiety and dread. They spent the following days in intense prayer and consultation, trying to understand how God could have allowed such a setback to their sacred mission. Margaret's journal entries from this period reveal her growing paranoia and obsession with the Whitmore case. She wrote extensively about the spiritual dangers of allowing marked children to survive, describing elaborate theories about how Grace Whitmore's birthmark might influence other children in the community. She became convinced that their failure to purify the child would lead to increased demonic activity in the region. Over the following months, the sisters began to monitor the Whitmore family obsessively. They made excuses to visit Rebecca, ostensibly to check on her recovery, but actually to observe Grace's development. They watched for signs of evil influence, interpreting every normal aspect of infant behavior as potential evidence of demonic activity. When Grace smiled, they saw it as evidence of unholy joy. When she cried, they interpreted it as the voice of evil demanding attention. The sisters' fixation on the Whitmore case began to affect their judgment in other situations. They became increasingly paranoid about their ability to identify marked children, developing more elaborate and expansive criteria for purification. They began to consider minor physical variations as potential signs of demonic influence, expanding their deadly mission to include children who might have survived their scrutiny in earlier years. Their growing anxiety led to more frequent purifications throughout 1840 and 1841. They murdered 18 infants during this period, each death justified by increasingly minor physical characteristics. A slightly asymmetrical ear became evidence of demonic distortion. A birth mole smaller than a pea was interpreted as a hidden mark of evil. Their paranoia had transformed them from selective killers into indiscriminate murderers who saw threats in every unusual physical characteristic. The sisters also began to develop elaborate rituals around their purifications, convinced that their previous methods had been insufficient to fully cleanse the spiritual contamination. They created detailed ceremonies involving prayer, scripture reading, and what they called purification blessings that were performed over each victim before and after death. These rituals served to further distance them from the reality of their actions, transforming murder into religious ceremony. But the Whitmore case had planted seeds of doubt that would continue to grow over the following years. The sisters had been forced to confront the possibility that their divine mission might not be as clear-cut as they had believed. They began to question whether they were correctly interpreting God's will, whether their criteria for identifying marked children were comprehensive enough, and whether their methods of purification were sufficiently thorough. These doubts manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. The sisters began to contradict each other about specific cases, arguing about whether particular children qualified for purification. They developed complex systems for confirming their decisions, requiring unanimous agreement before proceeding with any purification. They also began to second-guess their past actions, wondering if they had made errors in judgment that might have spiritual consequences. The psychological strain of their secret activities, combined with the stress of the Whitmore case, began to take its toll on the sisters' mental health. Margaret developed severe insomnia and began to experience what she described as divine visions that provided guidance about their mission. Catherine became increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours in solitary prayer and showing signs of depression. Agnes began to display symptoms of religious hysteria, speaking in tongues during their prayer sessions and claiming to receive direct communications from angels. By 1842, the Morrison sisters had evolved from confident instruments of divine will into paranoid obsessive murderers who lived in constant fear of discovery and divine judgment. Their failure to purify Grace Whitmore had shattered their sense of infallibility and forced them to confront the possibility that their mission might be flawed. But rather than abandoning their deadly activities, they doubled down on their commitment to purification, convinced that their previous failures had been the result of insufficient dedication rather than fundamentally flawed beliefs. The stage was set for the most intensive period of their murderous career as they attempted to compensate for their perceived failures through increased vigilance and more frequent purifications. The Morrison sisters had become trapped in a cycle of religious delusion and murderous compulsion that would drive them to commit their most heinous acts in the years to come. The winter of 1847 marked a turning point in the Morrison sisters' deadly career that would nearly expose their horrific secret. Mary Catherine Sullivan, a 16-year-old Irish immigrant, had arrived in the mountains with her husband Patrick, seeking refuge from the potato famine that had devastated their homeland. The young couple had established themselves in a small cabin near the Cumberland River, and Mary Catherine was expecting their first child during the brutal February cold snap that had trapped most families in their homes for weeks. The birth took place during a blizzard that howled through the mountains like a banshee, with snow piling so deep that the sisters had to use snowshoes to reach the Sullivan cabin. The isolation was complete. No neighbors could venture out in such conditions, and the nearest settlement was cut off by impassable drifts. It was the perfect setting for what the sisters believed would be another routine purification. Mary Catherine's labor was difficult and prolonged, lasting nearly 24 hours while the storm raged outside. The sisters worked by candlelight, their faces illuminated by flickering flames that cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. When the baby finally emerged, Agnes immediately noticed the distinctive birthmark that covered the infant's right cheek and extended down his neck. The mark was dark and irregularly shaped, resembling what superstitious minds might interpret as a clawed hand. But Mary Catherine Sullivan was not like their previous victims' mothers. Despite her youth and exhaustion, she possessed an Irish spirit that refused to be easily deceived. When Margaret began to move the baby away from her, claiming the need for medical examination, Mary Catherine struggled to sit up and demanded to see her child. "Give me my baby," she insisted, her voice carrying the authority of maternal instinct. "I want to hold him now." The sisters exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing the telltale signs of a mother who would not be easily separated from her child. But they had committed themselves to their deadly mission, and the birthmark was too prominent to ignore. Agnes attempted to distract Mary Catherine while Margaret prepared for the purification ritual. "You need to rest, dear," Agnes said softly, her angelic features arranged in an expression of false concern. "Let us clean him properly, and then you can hold him." But Mary Catherine's maternal instincts were fully aroused, and she could sense something wrong in the sisters' behavior. "There's something you're not telling me," Mary Catherine declared, her Irish accent becoming more pronounced with emotion. "What's wrong with my baby? Why won't you let me see him?" She attempted to rise from the bed, but Catherine gently restrained her, speaking in soothing tones about the need for maternal rest after difficult labor. The sisters found themselves in an impossible situation. They could not perform their purification ritual with Mary Catherine awake and alert, but they also could not allow the marked child to survive. Margaret made a decision that would haunt them for years to come. She decided to proceed with the purification despite the mother's presence, believing that they could convince her afterward that the baby had died from natural causes. What happened next would be seared into Mary Catherine's memory for the rest of her life. As Margaret held the infant and began to place her hands over his nose and mouth, Mary Catherine caught a glimpse of the action in the reflection of a mirror on the cabin wall. She saw Margaret's deliberate movements, saw the way the baby struggled briefly before going still, and realized with horror that she was witnessing the murder of her own child. "Sweet Jesus, what are you doing?" Mary Catherine screamed, her voice carrying a note of terror that seemed to penetrate the walls of the cabin. She lunged forward with superhuman strength, breaking free from Catherine's restraining hands and reaching for her baby. But it was too late. The infant was already dead, his tiny body limp in Margaret's arms. The sisters had never been confronted with a witness to their actions, and they found themselves unprepared for Mary Catherine's reaction. She fought like a wildcat, clawing and scratching at Margaret while screaming accusations in both English and Gaelic. The sisters were forced to physically restrain her, holding her down while Margaret began the familiar litany of explanations about complications and divine will. But Mary Catherine was not convinced. She had seen enough to know that her baby had been murdered, and she began to threaten the sisters with exposure. "You killed my baby!" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the snow-covered landscape. "You're murderers! Devils! I'll see you all hang for this!" The sisters realized that they faced their greatest crisis since beginning their deadly mission. Margaret made another fateful decision. Rather than attempting to silence Mary Catherine permanently, she chose to rely on the isolation of their location and the young woman's status as a foreign immigrant. "Who will believe you?" Margaret asked coldly, her religious mask slipping to reveal the calculating killer beneath. "You're a foreign woman, barely able to speak proper English, claiming that respected midwives are murderers. We've delivered hundreds of babies safely. You've just lost your mind with grief." The psychological warfare that followed was as cruel as the physical murder they had committed. The sisters spent hours convincing Mary Catherine that she was delusional, that her grief had caused her to imagine things that never happened. They quoted scripture about the dangers of false witness, reminded her of their reputation in the community, and suggested that her accusations would only bring shame and suspicion upon herself and her husband. Agnes played her role perfectly, weeping sympathetically while insisting that Mary Catherine's accusations were breaking her heart. "We've dedicated our lives to helping mothers and babies," she said through carefully manufactured tears. "How can you say such terrible things about us? We're heartbroken that your baby couldn't survive, but you mustn't blame us for God's will." The sisters' psychological manipulation was devastatingly effective. Mary Catherine, isolated in a foreign land with no family support and limited English skills, began to doubt her own perceptions. The sisters' reputation for skill and compassion seemed to contradict what she thought she had witnessed. Perhaps her grief really had caused her to imagine things that never happened. But deep in her heart, Mary Catherine knew what she had seen. She knew that her baby had been murdered, and she knew that the Morrison sisters were not the holy women they pretended to be. However, she also understood that she had no power to convince anyone of the truth. She was a foreign woman in a strange land, with no allies and no evidence beyond her own testimony. The sisters allowed Mary Catherine to hold her dead baby briefly, watching carefully as she grieved over his lifeless form. They spoke gently about the mystery of God's will and the blessing of knowing that her child was safe in heaven. They offered to handle the burial arrangements and even suggested that they would not charge for their services, given the tragic outcome. Patrick Sullivan arrived the next morning, having fought his way through the snowdrifts to reach his wife and child. The sisters met him with carefully prepared explanations about complications during birth and the tragic loss of his son. They spoke movingly about Mary Catherine's grief and the way sorrow could sometimes cause people to imagine things that never happened. Mary Catherine tried to tell her husband what she had witnessed, but Patrick was overwhelmed by grief and confused by his wife's wild accusations. The sisters' reputation and their gentle manner convinced him that his wife was indeed suffering from grief-induced delusions. He thanked them for their kindness and accepted their offer to handle the burial arrangements. The baby was interred in the sisters' secret cemetery, bringing their total number of victims to 63. But the Sullivan case had shaken them profoundly. For the first time, they had been directly confronted with their crimes by someone who had witnessed their actions. Although they had successfully discredited Mary Catherine's testimony, they realized how close they had come to exposure. In the days that followed, the sisters began to take additional precautions. They developed new methods for ensuring that mothers remained unconscious during purification rituals, and they created more elaborate systems for explaining infant deaths. They also began to carefully monitor the families of their victims, watching for signs of suspicion or unusual questions about their practices. But Mary Catherine Sullivan would not forget what she had seen. Although she never found anyone who believed her story, she carried the knowledge of the Morrison sisters' crimes for the rest of her life. She became a living witness to their evil, a reminder that their actions could not remain hidden forever. The sisters had survived their closest brush with exposure, but they had also created their most dangerous enemy, someone who knew the truth and would never stop believing it. You know, stories like this make you wonder how many other secrets are buried in the isolated corners of America, hidden by people who used authority and reputation to mask their true nature. If you're finding this tale as disturbing as I am, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about the Morrison sisters' ability to manipulate their victims. Are you brave enough to hear what happens when their secret finally begins to unravel? Subscribe to join the few who dare to uncover these dark truths. And let's continue this horrifying journey together. The psychological impact of the Sullivan case would plague the sisters for years to come, creating cracks in their unified front that would eventually lead to their downfall. But in the immediate aftermath, they responded by becoming even more careful and systematic in their deadly work, leading to the most intensive period of murder in their entire career. The year 1856 brought with it a convergence of events that would finally expose the Morrison sisters' 22-year reign of terror. Dr. James Whitmore, Rebecca's husband and now a prominent physician in the region, had been quietly investigating unusual patterns in infant mortality rates throughout the mountains. His medical training had led him to notice statistical anomalies that others had missed, and his suspicions had been gradually building over several years. Dr. Whitmore had been collecting birth and death records from various mountain communities, a task made difficult by the scattered nature of the population and the informal record-keeping practices of the time. What he discovered was deeply troubling. The Morrison sisters' delivery success rate was actually lower than the regional average, despite their reputation for skill and expertise. More specifically, infants born with visible birthmarks or minor physical abnormalities had a mortality rate nearly 3 times higher than the regional average when delivered by the Morrison sisters. The pattern became impossible to ignore when Dr. Whitmore cross-referenced his data with testimonies from grieving families. Time and again, he found stories of babies who had been born apparently healthy, but died suddenly from mysterious complications that the Morrison sisters claimed to have discovered. The medical explanations provided by the sisters often used impressive-sounding terminology, but when examined by someone with actual medical training, they revealed themselves to be either completely fictional or grossly exaggerated. Dr. Whitmore's investigation took on personal urgency when he remembered his own daughter Grace, now a healthy 12-year-old whose strawberry birthmark had faded to a barely visible pink spot on her shoulder. He recalled the Morrison sisters' strange behavior during Grace's birth, their insistence on examining her privately, and their unusual focus on what they had called spiritual concerns related to her birthmark. For the first time, he began to wonder if Grace had narrowly escaped some terrible fate. The breakthrough came when Dr. Whitmore encountered Mary Catherine Sullivan at a Methodist revival meeting in the spring of 1856. Mary Catherine, now the mother of 3 healthy children born with the assistance of other midwives, had never forgotten what she witnessed during her first child's birth. When she learned that Dr. Whitmore was investigating infant deaths in the region, she finally found someone who might believe her story. Mary Catherine's testimony was like a key, unlocking a terrible mystery. She described in vivid detail how she had witnessed Margaret Morrison deliberately suffocate her newborn son, how the sisters had psychologically manipulated her afterward, and how they had buried her baby in secret while claiming he had died from natural causes. Her account provided the missing piece that transformed Dr. Whitmore's statistical suspicions into certainty about the sisters' crimes. Armed with Mary Catherine's testimony and his own research, Dr. Whitmore began to approach other families who had lost children under the Morrison sisters' care. The process was delicate and painful, as he had to convince grieving parents to question the explanations they had accepted for their children's deaths. Many families initially resisted his inquiries, viewing his questions as attacks on their faith and their acceptance of God's will. But gradually, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Thomas Mackenzie, whose son had been the sisters' first victim 22 years earlier, admitted that he had always wondered about the sisters' insistence on handling all burial arrangements privately. Elizabeth Crawford revealed that the Morrison sisters had seemed strangely unsurprised when her daughter died, almost as if they had expected the tragedy. Jacob Morrison, no relation to the sisters, mentioned that his wife had reported strange behavior from the midwives during their son's birth, including whispered conversations and unexplained delays in allowing her to hold the baby. Dr. Whitmore realized that he needed physical evidence to support the mounting testimonial evidence against the Morrison sisters. He began to investigate the location where Mary Catherine claimed her son had been buried, along with other potential burial sites around the Morrison cabin. Using his medical knowledge and careful observation, he began to identify areas of disturbed soil that might indicate graves. The discovery that would seal the Morrison sisters' fate came on a grey October morning in 1856. Dr. Whitmore, accompanied by Sheriff William Hayes and several armed deputies, arrived at the Morrison cabin with a warrant to search the property. The sisters, now in their 60s and showing signs of the psychological strain of their long criminal career, initially attempted to maintain their facade of innocent midwives being persecuted by malicious rumors. But when the search party began to examine the area behind the cabin that Mary Catherine had described, they made a discovery that defied belief. The ground revealed evidence of more than 100 small graves, each carefully marked with wooden crosses that had weathered and fallen over the years. The sheer number of burial sites made it impossible for the sisters to claim they were simply the graves of babies who had died from natural causes. As the excavation continued, the full scope of the Morrison sisters' crimes became apparent. The tiny skeletons told a horrifying story of systematic infanticide spanning more than 2 decades. Many of the remains showed evidence of the physical characteristics that the sisters had deemed worthy of purification. Skulls with formations indicating cleft palates, extra ribs suggesting additional digits, and other minor variations that the sisters had interpreted as signs of demonic influence. But the most damning evidence came from Margaret Morrison's own hand. Hidden in a secret compartment within the walls of their cabin, the search team discovered the sisters' meticulously kept journals. These documents provided a complete record of their crimes, written in Margaret's careful script, and filled with religious justifications for each murder. The journals revealed not only the names and dates of their victims, but also detailed descriptions of their selection criteria and purification rituals. Reading from one of the journal entries, Sheriff Hayes discovered the chilling matter-of-fact tone with which the sisters had recorded their crimes. March 15th, 1841. Purified infant bearing the mark of the beast upon his forehead. The family has been comforted with knowledge of the child's salvation. God's work continues through our faithful hands. Entry after entry detailed similar murders, each one justified by twisted religious doctrine and described with disturbing calm. Confronted with undeniable evidence of their crimes, the Morrison sisters' carefully maintained facade finally crumbled. Margaret, always the leader of their deadly trio, initially attempted to justify their actions by explaining their divine mission to purify marked children. She spoke passionately about their religious duty and their role as instruments of God's will, seemingly unable to comprehend that others might view their actions as criminal rather than holy. Catherine broke down completely under questioning, sobbing as she confessed to her role in the murders while insisting that she had only followed Margaret's guidance. She revealed additional details about their methods and admitted to personally digging many of the graves in their secret cemetery. Her confession provided crucial corroboration for the evidence found at the burial site. Agnes, the youngest sister whose angelic appearance had fooled so many grieving families, displayed the most disturbing reaction to their exposure. She showed no remorse for their actions and continued to insist that they had performed sacred work. She spoke calmly about the children they had saved from lives of evil influence and expressed confusion about why their divine mission was being questioned. The interrogation revealed additional horrifying details about the sisters' crimes. They had developed elaborate rituals around their murders, including prayers and ceremonial elements that they believed enhanced the spiritual effectiveness of their purifications. They had also created detailed criteria for identifying children worthy of death, criteria that had expanded over the years to include increasingly minor physical variations. As news of the sisters' arrest spread throughout the mountain communities, the reaction was one of shock, horror, and disbelief. Families who had trusted the Morrison sisters with their most precious moments began to question every interaction they had experienced with the murderous midwives. Parents who had lost children under the sisters' care were forced to confront the possibility that their babies had been murdered rather than claimed by natural causes. The psychological impact on the affected families was devastating. Parents who had found comfort in believing their children had died from God's will now faced the knowledge that their babies had been brutally murdered by women they had trusted and respected. The grief that many had processed and accepted was suddenly raw and immediate again, complicated by feelings of guilt, anger, and betrayal. Mary Catherine Sullivan, whose testimony had been crucial in exposing the sisters' crimes, experienced a complex mixture of vindication and renewed trauma. After years of carrying the burden of knowledge that no one would believe, she finally had proof that her memories were accurate. But the confirmation of her worst fears about her son's death brought back all the pain and horror of that snowy night in 1847. Dr. Whitmore found himself both celebrated and haunted by his role in exposing the Morrison sisters. While his investigation had prevented future murders and brought justice for the victims, he was deeply disturbed by the scope of the crimes and the realization that they had continued undetected for more than 2 decades. He struggled with questions about whether earlier action on his part might have saved some of the later victims. The Morrison sisters were charged with multiple counts of murder, though the exact number of charges was limited by the difficulty of identifying specific victims and proving individual cases beyond reasonable doubt. The journal entries provided compelling evidence, but the passage of time and the secretive nature of their crimes made prosecution challenging. Margaret Morrison, as the admitted leader of their criminal enterprise, faced the most serious charges. Her journal entries clearly established her as the architect of their murderous doctrine and the primary decision-maker in selecting victims. Catherine and Agnes were charged as accomplices, though their level of culpability was debated given Margaret's apparent dominance over their actions. The trial would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Kentucky history, attracting attention from newspapers throughout the region and beyond. The combination of infanticide, religious fanaticism, and systematic deception created a story that captured public imagination while horrifying observers with its scope and brutality. The trial of the Morrison sisters began in the spring of 1857, transforming the small courthouse in Harlan County into the center of national attention. Newspaper reporters arrived from as far away as New York and Philadelphia, drawn by the unprecedented nature of the case and the shocking details that had emerged during the investigation. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, many of them families who had been affected by the sisters' crimes. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney Robert Sterling, presented a methodical case that relied heavily on the sisters' own journal entries and the testimony of Mary Catherine Sullivan. Sterling painted a picture of three women who had perverted their medical knowledge and religious authority to commit systematic murder over more than 2 decades. He read extensively from Margaret's journals, allowing the sisters' own words to condemn them in the eyes of the jury. Dr. Whitmore's testimony provided crucial scientific evidence about the patterns of infant mortality in the region and the statistical impossibility of the deaths being natural. His calm, professional demeanor and clear medical explanations helped the jury understand how the sisters had used their expertise to deceive grieving families and cover their crimes. Mary Catherine Sullivan's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Her detailed account of witnessing her son's murder, delivered in her still noticeable Irish accent, brought many spectators to tears and provided the only direct eyewitness evidence of the sisters' methods. Her courage in finally speaking the truth after years of being dismissed and disbelieved made her a powerful figure for justice. The defense, led by attorney Jonathan Morrison, again no relation to the defendants, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against the sisters was overwhelming, and their own confessions had already established their guilt. The defense strategy focused on arguing for mercy based on the sisters' apparent religious delusions and their genuine belief that they were performing divine work. Character witnesses testified about the sisters' reputation for piety and their apparent devotion to helping mountain families. Several ministers spoke about their extensive biblical knowledge and their active participation in church activities. The defense argued that the sisters had been driven to their crimes by religious mania rather than evil intent, and that their mental state at the time of the murders should be considered in determining their punishment. Margaret Morrison's testimony on her own behalf was perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire trial. Speaking in the same calm, measured tones that had comforted so many grieving families, she explained her theological justification for the murders. She quoted scripture extensively and described her belief that marked children were literal vessels of evil that posed threats to the spiritual welfare of their communities. "We were instruments of divine mercy," Margaret declared, her pale eyes fixed on the jury. Those children would have lived lives of corruption and evil, spreading darkness wherever they went. By purifying them in infancy, we saved their souls and protected countless others from their influence. I believe with all my heart that God will bless us for our faithful service to His holy will. Catherine's testimony revealed the psychological dynamics within the sister trio. She described how she had initially resisted Margaret's interpretation of their religious duty, but had gradually been convinced that their mission was divinely inspired. Her obvious distress and genuine remorse for her actions created some sympathy among observers, though it did little to change the facts of her participation in the murders. Agnes maintained her disturbing calm throughout her testimony, continuing to insist that their actions had been not only justified, but necessary. She spoke about the children they had saved, as if discussing a successful medical practice, showing no recognition of the horror of their crimes. Her complete lack of remorse and continued belief in their divine mission made her perhaps the most frightening of the three sisters. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about the sisters' crimes that had not emerged during the initial investigation. They had apparently kept detailed records not only of their victims, but also of children they had delivered safely, noting with disappointment when babies they considered borderline cases for purification had been allowed to live due to family circumstances or other complications. The sisters had also developed increasingly elaborate criteria for identifying children worthy of death, expanding their original focus on birthmarks and obvious physical defects to include subtle variations in skin tone, unusual hair patterns, and even what they considered spiritually significant birth timing. Their paranoia and religious delusions had clearly intensified over the years, leading them to see demonic influence in increasingly minor physical characteristics. Expert testimony from ministers and theologians unanimously condemned the sisters' interpretation of Scripture as heretical and dangerous. Representatives from multiple denominations testified that no legitimate Christian doctrine supported the systematic murder of infants, regardless of physical characteristics or perceived spiritual markings. The theological consensus was that the sisters had created their own twisted religion that bore no resemblance to authentic Christian faith. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for all 3 sisters. The speed of their decision reflected both the overwhelming evidence against the defendants and the horror of their crimes. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdicts were announced, though many spectators were also moved to tears by the magnitude of the tragedy that had been revealed. Judge Harrison Caldwell sentenced Margaret Morrison to death by hanging, calling her crimes an abomination against God, nature, and human decency. Catherine and Agnes received life sentences in consideration of their apparent subservience to Margaret's leadership, though the judge made clear that their crimes deserved no less severe punishment. Margaret Morrison was executed on October 15, 1857, in front of a crowd of nearly 3,000 spectators who had traveled from throughout Kentucky and neighboring states to witness the end of one of America's most prolific female serial killers. She maintained her religious delusions until the end, spending her final moments on the gallows, praying for the souls of the children she had murdered, and expressing confidence that God would reward her for her faithful service. Catherine Morrison died in prison in 1864, reportedly from a combination of tuberculosis and what prison officials described as a complete mental breakdown. She had spent her final years in a state of deep depression and religious obsession, constantly praying for forgiveness while maintaining that she had only followed her sister's guidance. Agnes Morrison lived until 1871, spending 14 years in prison while continuing to insist that their actions had been divinely inspired. She died unrepentant, still believing that she and her sisters had performed sacred work. The Morrison sisters' secret cemetery was consecrated as a proper burial ground, with each tiny grave marked with a headstone bearing the inscription, "Unknown Child, Victim of Madness." The site became a place of pilgrimage for affected families and a sobering reminder of how religious fanaticism could be twisted into justification for unspeakable crimes. Dr. James Whitmore continued his medical practice and became a leading advocate for improved training and regulation of midwives throughout Kentucky. He established a scholarship fund in memory of the Morrison sisters' victims and worked tirelessly to ensure that such crimes could never again be hidden behind a facade of medical authority and religious respectability. Mary Catherine Sullivan became something of a folk hero in the region, celebrated for her courage in finally speaking the truth about what she had witnessed. She used her newfound voice to advocate for immigrant rights and women's protection, drawing on her experience of being dismissed and disbelieved to help other marginalized voices be heard. The case of the Morrison sisters sent shockwaves throughout American society, leading to increased scrutiny of medical practitioners and calls for better oversight of religious communities. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the way that isolation and fanaticism could corrupt even those who appeared most devoted to helping others. The legacy of the Morrison sisters serves as a dark reminder that evil can hide behind the most benevolent facades, and that the combination of medical knowledge, religious authority, and systematic deception can create monsters capable of unimaginable crimes. Their story stands as testament to the importance of questioning authority, supporting victims who speak difficult truths, and maintaining vigilance against those who would use faith and expertise to mask their true intentions. The 156 innocent children who died at the hands of the Morrison sisters were finally given the justice they deserved, though that justice came far too late to save their lives. Their memory serves as a reminder that every life has value, regardless of physical characteristics or perceived imperfections, and that no religious or medical authority justifies taking innocent life. This horrifying chapter in American history shows us how easily good intentions can be corrupted by fanaticism, how isolation can foster dangerous delusions, and how the trust placed in medical and religious authorities can be exploited by those with evil intent. The Morrison sisters believed they were saving souls, but they were nothing more than murderers who used faith as a mask for their crimes. What do you think about this case? Does it make you question how we place trust in authority figures? The Morrison sisters' story reminds us that evil can wear the most convincing disguises, and that we must always remain vigilant against those who would use our faith and vulnerability against us. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to hear more stories about the dark secrets hidden in America's past, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone brave enough to handle these disturbing truths. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters are often those who convince us they're our protectors.